Morning, my name is Botan, and today I want to cover and make a brief overview on Jacques Derrida, Deconstruction Strategy, and on author at whole. Jacques Derrida was one of the most well-known 20th century philosophers. He was also one of the most prolific, distancing himself from the various philosophical movements and traditions that preceded him on the French intellectual scene. He developed a strategy called deconstruction in the mid-60s. Although not purely negative, deconstruction is primarily concerned with something tantamount to a critique of the Western philosophical tradition. Deconstruction is generally presented via an analysis of specific texts. It seeks to expose and then to subvert the various binary oppositions that undergird our dominant ways of thinking, presence-absence, speech-writing, and so forth. Deconstruction has at least two aspects, literary and philosophical. The literary aspect concerns the textual interpretation, where invention is essential to find hidden alternative meanings in the text. The philosophical aspect concerns the main target of deconstruction, the metaphysics of presence, or simply metaphysics. Starting from an Heideggerian point of view, Derrida argues that metaphysics affects the whole of philosophy from Plato onwards. Metaphysics creates dualistic oppositions and installs a hierarchy that unfortunately privileges one term of each dichotomy: presence before absence, speech before writing, and so on. The deconstruction strategy is to unmask these two sedimented ways of thinking, and it operates on them especially through two steps: reversing dichotomies and attempting to corrupt the dichotomies themselves. The strategy also aims to show that they are undecidables, that is, something that cannot conform to either side of the dichotomy or opposition. Undecidability returns to a later period of Derrida's reflection when it is applied to reveal paradoxes involved in notions such as gift, giving, or hospitality, whose conditions of possibility are at the same time their conditions of impossibility. Because of this, it is undecidable whether authentic giving or hospitality are either possible or impossible. In this period, the founder of deconstruction turns his attention to ethical themes, in particular the theme of responsibility to the other. Leads Derrida to leave the idea that responsibility is associated with a behavior publicly and rationally justifiable by general principles. Reflected among tales of Jewish tradition, he highlights the absolute singularity of responsibility to the other. Deconstruction has had an enormous influence in psychology, literary theory, cultural studies, linguistics, feminism, sociology, and anthropology. Placed in the interstices between philosophy and non-philosophy, or philosophy and literature, it is not difficult to see why this is the case. Derrida's initial work in philosophy was largely phenomenological, and his early training as a philosopher was done largely through the lens of Husserl. Other important inspiration in his early though include Nietzsche, Heidegger, Saussure, Levinas, and Freud, and Derrida acknowledges his indebtedness to all of these thinkers in the development of his approach to texts, which has come to be known as deconstruction. It was in 1967 that Derrida really arrived as a philosopher of world importance. He published three momentous texts, it is, of grammatology, writing and difference, and speech and phenomena. All of these works have been influential for different reasons, but it is of grammatology that remains his most famous work. In Of Grammatology, Derrida reveals and then undermines the speech-writing opposition that he argues has been such an influential factor in Western thought. His preoccupation with language in this text is typical of much of his early work, and since the publication of this and other major texts, deconstruction has gradually moved from occupying a major role in continental Europe to also becoming a significant player in the Anglo-American philosophical context. Deconstruction has frequently been the subject of some controversy. When Derrida was awarded an honorary doctorate in Cambridge in 1992, there were hosts of protests from many analytic philosophers. Since then, Derrida has also had many dialogues with philosophers like John Searle, in which deconstruction has been roundly criticized, although perhaps unfairly at times. However, what is clear from the antipathy of such thinkers is that deconstruction challenges traditional philosophy in several important ways. So what does it mean, this deconstructive strategy? Derrida, like many other contemporary European theorists, is preoccupied with undermining the oppositional tendencies that have befallen much of the Western philosophical tradition. In fact, dualisms are the staple diet of deconstruction, for without these hierarchies and orders of subordination, it would be left with nowhere to intervene. Deconstruction is parasitic in that rather than espousing yet another ground narrative, a theory about the nature of the world in which we partake, it restricts itself to distorting already existing narratives and to revealing the dualistic hierarchies they conceal. While Derrida's claims to being someone who speaks solely in the margins of philosophy can be contested, it is important to take these claims into account. Deconstruction is, somewhat infamously, the philosophy that says nothing. Deconstruction, and particularly early deconstruction, functions by engaging in sustained analysis of particular texts. It is committed to the rigorous analysis of the literal meaning of a text, and yet also to finding within that meaning, perhaps in the neglected corners of the text, internal problems that actually point towards alternative meanings. Deconstruction must hence establish a methodology that pays close attention to these apparently contradictory imperatives, and a reading of any Derridean text can only reaffirm this dual aspect. Derrida speaks of the first aspect of this deconstruction strategy as being akin to a fidelity and a desire to be faithful to the themes and audacities of the thinking. At the same time, however, deconstruction also famously borrows from Martin Heidegger's conception of a destructive retrieve and seeks to open texts up to alternative and usually repressed meanings that reside at last partly outside of the metaphysical tradition. This more violent and transgressive aspect of deconstruction is illustrated by Derrida's consistent exhortation to invent in your own language if you can or want to hear mine, invent if you can or want to give my language to be understood. In suggesting that a faithful interpretation of him is one that goes beyond him, Derrida installs invention is a vitally important aspect of any deconstructive reading. These are, of course, themes reflected upon at length by Derrida, and they have an immediate consequence on the meta-theoretical level, to the minimal extent that we can refer to Derrida's own arguments, and it must be recognized that they are always intertwined with the arguments of whomever or whatever, and he seeks to deconstruct. For example, Derrida argues that his critique of the Husserlian now moment is actually based upon resources within Husserl's own text, which lead in the self-presence that he was attempting to secure. If Derrida's point is simply that Husserl's phenomenology holds within itself conclusions that Husserl failed to recognize, Derrida seems to be able to disavow any transcendental or ontological position. This is why he argues that his work occupies a place in the margins of philosophy rather than simply being philosophy per se. Deconstruction contends that in any text there are inevitably points of equivocation and undecidability that betray any staple meaning that an author might seek to impose upon his or her text. The process of writing always reveals that which has been suppressed, covers over that which has been disclosed, and more generally preaches the very opposition that are thought to sustain it. This is why Derrida's philosophy is so textually based, and it is also why his key terms always changing, because depending upon who or what he is seeking to deconstruct, the point of equivocation will also be located in different place. This also ensures that any attempt to describe what deconstruction is must be careful. Nothing would be more antithetical to deconstruction stated intent than this attempt at defining it through the decidedly metaphysical question: what is deconstruction? There is a paradoxality involved in trying to restrict deconstruction to one particular and overarching purpose when it is predicated upon the desire to expose us to that which is wholly other and to open us up to alternative possibilities. At times, this exegesis will run the risk of ignoring the many meanings of the Derridean deconstruction, and the widely acknowledged difference between Derrida's early and late work is merely the most obvious example of the difficulties involved in suggestion. Deconstruction says this, or deconstruction prohibits that. That said, certain defining features of deconstruction can be noticed. For example, Derrida's entire enterprise is predicated upon the conviction that dualisms are irrevocably present in the various philosophers and artisans that he considers. While some philosophers argue that he is a little reductive when he talks about the Western philosophical tradition, it is his understanding of this tradition that informs and provides the tools for a deconstructive response. Because of this, it is worth briefly considering the target of Derrida and Deconstruction, the metaphysics of presence, or somewhat synonymously logocentrism. Thank you very much for your attention, subscribe, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.